Hello, my name is Harry Kazianis. I'm the managing editor of the National Interest. We continue on our video interview series today. We're speaking with Ely Ratner. Ely is a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. He's an expert on all things Asia, but specifically Asian defense issues, China's rise, and so forth. So Ely, to start out, we have President Obama heading to Asia very soon.
Yep.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the trip, the APEC summit. What are your expectations? Do you expect any major news to break? What do you expect between the interaction between Xi Jinping and Obama? What's your analysis?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely.
As someone who reads a lot about Asia, I think it's safe to say when the history of this period is written that people will be looking at the articles and products that were coming out of the national interest that were on the website. I think it's arguably ground zero for debates about Asia strategy currently here in Washington. So I'm happy to be a contributor, of course, happy to be here today, so keep up the good work. In terms of the president's trip, he'll be in Beijing for about 3.5 days or so. There will be two parts of that trip. The first part of the trip will be as part of the APEC Leaders Summit, and then the second part will be a bilateral summit with Xi Jinping. So let me talk about each of those in turn. In terms of the APEC summit, all 21 leaders will be there. There will be all sorts of dramas, actually. It will be relatively exciting for an international economics conference. But there, of course, will be all of the normal work that APEC does, which has to do with economic development, infrastructure development, lowering trade barriers, inclusive growth, sustainable growth, a lot of sort of regular issues that they deal with. But there's also going to be other things happening on the sidelines that I think folks will be looking for. One, of course, will be President Putin will be there. And my understanding is he's slated to speak relatively close to President Obama, so they may be in the same room, they may be interacting, there will be people looking at that. More broadly than that, I think that this APEC summit is important for Xi Jinping. China has always taken these international events very seriously. The 2008 Summer Olympics was a very important event for the Chinese, as sort of a coming out party as a great power. And I think this is the first big international political event under Xi Jinping. And so it's very important for him to be appearing strong. And I think the Chinese government will do everything it can to present this as a show in many ways. What's interesting, however, is there were two big initiatives that Beijing was hoping to announce during this APEC summit. One, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, which is a brainchild of Beijing to create a new multilateral investing bank to mirror the IMF or the Asian Development Bank. And the other thing that Beijing has been pushing for the last year to be as part of this meeting is what's being called FTAP, a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. Now, what's interesting is that in both cases, what we're going to see out of this meeting is going to be much less ambitious than what Beijing had originally planned. For the AIIB, the investment bank, they had hoped that a number of advanced economies would be participating, like South Korea and Australia and others. It turns out many of them are currently sitting out the launch of this organization because of concerns about environmental standards, labor standards, transparency, corruption, et cetera. So I think what would have potentially been a very prominent rollout of this bank will be much more subdued. And in fact, my understanding is that China had sought to include support for this bank within the leaders' statement at APEC, and that actually is not going to happen. So I would say it's a feather in Beijing's cap, but it's not the big success that Xi Jinping was hoping for. And the same can be said of this free trade area, where initially, this is something that even the United States has supported, an effort to try to harmonize what was told to me something like 75 or 80 free trade agreements in Asia, bilateral and multilateral, all very different in a general sense that to the extent that these could be rationalized, all the better. But what Beijing appeared to want to do a year ago was to turn what people are talking about as a free trade area, to coordinate existing free trade agreements into a new free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific. So it's a very important word. Is this a free trade area or is this a free trade agreement? The latter requiring actual negotiations of a new free trade agreement, which would potentially cause problems or rival or challenge the existing negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it wasn't just the United States. Many of the APEC countries said, hold on a sec here. We're not ready to enter into a new region-wide free trade agreement. let's dial this back. And in fact, Beijing did. Now we're talking about a free trade agreement. And there's some discussion about at APEC of launching an assessment or a study, a feasibility study about what this might look like. But it won't be what Beijing had originally hoped for, which was the launch of a free trade agreement and some actual timetable for negotiation. So again, a very ambitious initial goal for the Chinese government that has been rolled back to something much more modest. So in some ways, yes, it'll be a big coming out for China, but on the other hand, because of their own limitations, because of concerns of others in the region, it won't be quite the party they were hoping to throw. So that would be my general assessment on APEC. On the meeting between President Obama and President Xi, again, very important for the Chinese side to have a very positive meeting here. There's been a lot of high-level diplomacy back and forth. Susan Rice was in Beijing. Chinese leaders were here in Washington, meeting with Secretary Kerry, meeting with the White House, trying to set the stage to have a relatively positive visit. And I think that's what we'll see, even though there's been a relatively tense couple years in the relationship, I would say, particularly in the last year. The feeling of this will be building upon what the administration would describe as momentum out of the strategic and economic dialogue and other engagements we've had. And from the perspective of the Obama administration, obviously, in the wake of the elections and with some of the other difficulties in international politics that President Obama is facing, I think this is Asia and China is one area where the administration would like to see a more positive, successful presentation or success of their approach or their policies. So I think what we'll see out of the administration is not calls for a new era of U.S.-China relations or big changes in U.S. policy, but rather an effort to try to move away from big frameworks, big conceptual notions of the relationship toward deliverables, which have to be part of any trip like this. But what those are supposed to be are demonstrations that the United States is invested in the relationship and is invested in seeing concrete, practical outcomes. So we'll see new initiatives on military-to-military diplomacy, maybe some new agreements to work on things like Ebola and Afghanistan, as well as efforts to try to move toward a bilateral investment treaty, though I don't think they're there yet. I think, again, from the U.S. perspective, we're sober-eyed about the challenge. We're looking to manage differences. We're looking to enhance cooperation, but at a very practical level, not at a high conceptual level. So I think this is an important visit, but I don't think it'll be a historical or a landmark visit in any real way.
Okay. So staying with APEC for a moment, there's another possible angle to this summit. The possible meeting or handshake between China's President Xi Jinping and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Yep. And there's been a lot of different articles, different interests, talking about that maybe the Japanese could possibly consider in some way, shape, or form acknowledging that there's a dispute when it comes to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Right. Give us your assessment. Do you think that Japanese-Chinese relations have sort of a viable path forward? I mean, there's been a lot of tension over the last couple of years. Where do you see the relationship going over the long term?
Well, I think you're right to say the relationship right now is at a pretty bad place. And that's reflected both in government policy, government rhetoric, as well as public opinion polling, which if you ask the Chinese how favorably do you view Japan, or if you ask the Japanese how favorably do you view China, the numbers are historically bad. So I think there is a sense that things really are worse than just sort of a normal cyclical blowing of hot and cold. And there are real issues of competition, particularly in the security space. What we've seen over the last month, you're right, is an effort, again, ahead of the APEC meeting where Shinzo Abe will be in Beijing, to try to create a more positive atmosphere. I think from the Chinese side, the incentive there is that they don't want Japan-China antagonisms to be tainting the broader atmospherics of the meeting. And from the Japanese side, they've been looking to meet with Xi Jinping, and I think from an economic standpoint, both sides would like to see better relations. I think structurally there are both very strong incentives for better relations and fundamental reasons why tensions are quite high. And in fact, whether there's a handshake or not, I don't think people are thinking that that's going to do a lot to set the relationship on a much more positive course, because there are such fundamental differences. As to what will actually happen at APEC, yet unclear. The reporting from the Chinese side, the official Chinese media, which is probably the closest we get to public insight into what they're thinking, remains mixed. The door certainly remains open. Some kind of an official meeting is not going to occur. There may be a handshake, though the Chinese have been calling for Abe to actually there were two conditions that they set forward. One was some sort of promise to deal with history issues, perhaps to promise not to visit the Yasukuni Shrine, and the other to acknowledge the dispute over the Senkakus. Now, we're certainly not going to see, I would expect, Japan to go as far as China would like in that regard. There have been some media reports within Japan that Japanese officials may be willing to say something like, we recognize that China has an issue, or we recognize that China has a claim, though that doesn't affect Japan's own assessment of what the state of the sovereignty dispute is. So it would likely be maybe a step in that direction, but not as far as anyone would like to go. But again, I think in this case, it'll be largely symbolic, and the competition will continue. The big question is, of the somewhat more positive atmospherics that we saw over the last month that have included, in some instances, a reduction of certain Chinese patrols in the East China Sea, is that just a tactical maneuver because they want to have a more positive APEC meeting, or is this a signal that they're actually looking to moderate their behavior over the longer term? So really, the most interesting things, the most telling things about impact on the Japan-China relationship will not be what are they doing now ahead of the meeting, because we don't know, is this a strategic shift or not, but how enduring is it in December and January and February? And of course, myself and I think all Americans who work on Asia issues would very much like to see better relations between Japan and China for economic reasons, for security reasons. But I do have my doubts, given that it's a very common practice, actually, for China ahead of these big international meetings to take these sort of steps to try to, again, create a more positive atmosphere. We've seen this frequently ahead of ASEAN meetings, where even if the South China Sea, for instance, is very tense at a certain time, China will reach out to ASEAN, will declare that it's all of a sudden very interested in negotiations on a code of conduct, just to cut the legs out from under potential critics at these meetings, but then afterward there hasn't been real fundamental change. So I think, is there a handshake or not? It'll make a lot of news. There will be a lot of photographs. Whether it changes anything or not, I'd be relatively suspicious or suspect.
So moving on, something you alluded to in the first question is the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right.
Seems like the talk has maybe died down a little bit on it, but it's still sort of there as a big issue. Where do you see it going in the long term? Obviously, the Japanese have some problems trying to get it passed with the farm lobby in Japan that has a lot of influence in Parliament. But you also have people here in the United States that are very much against the deal. Do you think long term it can get done? Where do you see it going?
Well, this is a hugely important issue, I think, both in the region and here in Washington. There's a general agreement that this is not only just a trade deal, this is a deal of strategic importance in terms of both keeping the United States as a leader on economic issues in the region and ensuring that the economic architecture of the region is at a high standard. So it's seen as an important long-term issue. Whether it gets done, of course, there are two big factors. There's the international negotiations of the deal, and then there's the domestic politics back here in the United States. My sense is that there's actually progress on both of those tracks. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think if this thing's going to happen, the next several months will be critical. There's been a sense of closing, of a narrowing of differences between the United States and Japan. Again, on the international negotiation side, a lot of work to be done, but I think both, again, President Obama and Prime Minister Abe understand how important this is from a strategic perspective, not just from an economic perspective, and that at a certain point it becomes necessary to take on potential domestic constituencies who are going to have issues with one or the other. And from the U.S. perspective, it was a very difficult issue for the Obama administration ahead of the midterm elections, not wanting to put moderate Democrats, particularly in states where their constituents may oppose the deal, not wanting to put them in that position ahead of the elections. Obviously, that's now past us. So we have a political window, both in the lame duck session, but then under the Republican Congress to get this thing through. And we've seen some reporting that Senator Wyden and Senator Hatch have been trading notes on potential legislation. And to the extent that there are areas of agreement for a new GOP Congress to work with the president, all the analysis we've seen has said that trade is one of those, if not at the top of the list, where we have, from the administration's perspective, a legacy, not only something the president believes in, but a legacy item as part of the rebalancing to Asia, the piece that will make the rebalancing to Asia a real, sustainable, comprehensive policy, as had been the aim from the beginning. And from the Republican side, something that not only, again, comports with their ideological position, but also something that could demonstrate their ability to govern and manage ahead of the 2016 elections. I think the concerns are, how does the Republican Party want to play this once they have, given during the lame duck session, and then once they have control, and the political dynamics there get incredibly hard to predict. So one would suggest, well, even if the Democrats wanted to move this in December during the lame duck session, wouldn't the Republicans oppose that so then they could take it up under their own majority? That's one concern. The other is, well, will the GOP at the end of the day be willing to hand Obama that victory, that legacy that he may be looking for? Might they not rather, both for partisan reasons, but also rather keep it as an issue to infect the Democratic Party presidential primary, where a moderate candidate like Hillary Clinton would be put in a very difficult position on a trade deal like that if there was a candidate running to her left that was running, trying to build support among a more liberal base on issues like environment and labor and others. So there are political incentives to try to not complete a deal at this point. But my hope is that all the main actors involved, the president, Mitch McConnell, and others, understand this as a national security issue, a national interest issue. And at the end of the day, despite all the difficult politics that go into a trade deal, that'll win the day. That's still my hope. And in fact, I think we're closer to that than where we were 6 months, or 6 months ago, 12 months ago. So, but the next several months are very critical. I think most people think if this doesn't get done in the next year, for instance, that we're way too far into the 2016 presidential cycle, and that partners in the region will be less confident about putting their own necks on the line about a deal that may never get done. So time is very much of the essence.
Okay. So my final question for you, Eli, and this is something that you've written in the National Interest about, a lot of other outlets. Looking at Chinese sort of grand strategy in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, a lot of talk about various different, what a lot of people consider assertive moves. Patrols around the Senkaku Islands, building islands now in the South China Sea. You had a very, very comprehensive article in the National Interest about Scarborough Reef. Where do you see sort of U.S. strategy play in this? There's a lot of talk, a lot of speculation that the United States doesn't have the right approach in sort of shaping Chinese behavior, maybe to do less of these things, maybe to stop these type of actions. At present, do the United States have the right strategy to sort of maybe get the Chinese to look at these things in different ways? Are we doing the right things to speaking to the Chinese in terms of being effective, maybe to stop some of these maneuvers? Where do you see it playing out?
Well, the first, just a couple sort of preemptive things to say in response to your question. I mean, one, I think we have to be careful what we describe as a Chinese grand strategy, because I think it's very difficult to see exactly where the root causes of a lot of these actions. I think it's a combination of political and military and domestic and economic incentives that are driving a number of bureaucratic actors to be pushing in the same direction rather than a very coherent, formulated approach. And the other thing I would say is this is an incredibly difficult problem for the United States, because the way that China has gone about engaging in the territorial nibbling or the coercion that you've described and that I've written about has all been below the military threshold. It's been very incremental, what political scientists would call salami slicing. So using Coast Guard ships, drilling with oil rigs, passing national laws, maps, like very steps that are very difficult to respond to and very difficult to deter, to know how it's coming in advance. So the policy problem, even in and of itself, is a real problem. These places are very far from the United States. And the other thing that makes it difficult, of course, is that we have a very comprehensive relationship with China. So if you're looking at just the territorial issue, as I often do, it's very easy to get animated about this particular issue, but I always have to be reminded, or I always remind myself, look at the big picture, because as much as you'd like to focus just on this issue, even though I don't agree with statements that describe Secretary Kerry just the other day, this week, gave a speech at SAIS calling the U.S.-China relationship the most consequential relationship in the 21st century, or other American officials saying there's really no major issue that we could solve without cooperating with China. I wouldn't go that far, but I do think it's important to remember that a very negative or competitive relationship with China would make it difficult for the United States on the range of international issues that we care about, from Russia to Syria to Iraq to climate, really across the board, that we have to be. One of the reasons why there is a built-in moderation in American policy toward China, even though there are things they do that are very counterproductive, is that we have to keep the much broader picture in mind. So I guess that's the background. To answer your question more directly, I think we have seen the administration become increasingly concerned about these issues. So as they have become more prevalent, we have seen a number of steps that include the access agreement with the Philippines, now selling lethal arms or indicating the ability to sell lethal arms to Vietnam, much stronger rhetoric from State Department officials about concern about these issues. But the problem is they're still continuing. And I think that's one of the challenges from the U.S. perspective, is that when we talk about shaping Chinese behavior, the kinds of things that U.S. officials used to believe worked to influence Chinese behavior aren't working as well anymore. Things like trying to build opprobrium from the region, or going to regional meetings and getting the region to collectively express concern about what China is doing. That these types of things, sort of the political shaming, regional shaming, reputational cost route, seems to be relatively ineffective at this point. And so I think that the question arises then, what do you do about Chinese assertiveness? And some of the work that we've been doing at CNIS and others are thinking about, for lack of a better term, how to impose cost upon China. And when we say China, we have to think not about a big country, but about specific individuals, specific bureaucratic actors, to try to make them rethink some of these approaches. Because I think one of the things one could argue is that despite some of the regional criticism or others that China has faced for these actions, it's very likely that when they look over the course of the last couple of years, they see themselves making incremental gains. And yeah, they're facing criticism. Yeah, there's been some hardening in the region, but they are, in fact, making progress in terms of advancing their territorial and sovereignty claims. So I think that we have to rethink about, are they achieving their goals? Are they facing sufficient cost? And in some ways, sometimes it feels like they're pushing on an open door. Again, it's a very difficult problem for the United States. The big issue, I think, that the most important piece of this entire issue that I've been trying to highlight in the work that I've been doing is that what we've seen over the last year, in my view, has been a very important transition, where in the last several years, if you went through 2010, 2011, 2012, China was engaging in acts of assertiveness, acts of coercion. I think that's relatively uncontroversial. But they were doing it largely in the context of reacting to what they thought were the provocations of others, rightly or wrongly. But with the incident at Scarborough Reef, they escalated very quickly, ended up seizing that feature and continue to occupy it today. But they did so in the context of the Philippines using a naval vessel rather than a Coast Guard vessel to perform a interdiction operation against illegal Chinese fishermen. And from their perspective, if you're using a naval vessel, that's about sovereignty. That's about national defense. It's not about law enforcement. So that they felt like the Philippines had crossed a red line. In the case of the Senkakus, there was the November 2012, what the Chinese call the nationalization of the islands, where Tokyo essentially had to purchase a couple of the islands to prevent a more nationalist political figure from doing so and engaging in potentially destabilizing activity. So shaky ground for the Chinese to complain. Nonetheless, there was some pretext for them to be increasing their patrols and acting a little more assertively around the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu Islands. But what we've seen over the last year and under the presidency of Xi Jinping, and what's very alarming from my perspective, is unilateral actions of assertiveness, ones that don't have that previous provocation. So things like the air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, or the oil rig incident with the Vietnamese in the South China Sea, that very provocative steps where there was no previous provocation from a regional state. And in fact, Chinese officials and Chinese strategists have changed their tune on this. And now they say, well, we're not just responding to action X or Y from a country in the region. What we're responding to is the injustices in the South China Sea of the last 30 years, that while we've been taking a more diplomatic wait-and-see approach, others have been, the Philippines, the Japanese, and others have been advancing their claims, doing all these things like land reclamation and otherwise. We're strong now, we're not going to take it anymore, and we're not going to sit on the sidelines. And that's a much more difficult problem, because if they were in fact previously just responding to particular provocations, then then we can all work together to try to moderate behavior, and they would hopefully do so as well. But if we're in an environment now where they're basically along a more historical revisionist past of saying, well, based upon historical grievances, we're now going to redraw the territorial boundaries of Asia, then we're in a very bad place, because it becomes very difficult to try to do anything. We can't rewrite history. So it is a matter, again, of elevating these issues. And I think one of the first steps in terms of what does the United States need to do here is to give these issues more prominence in that wide spectrum of issues in the U.S.-China relationship. We have a way of talking about territorial disputes in Asia and in the South China Sea that presents it sort of as the other. It's about international norms, it's about international order, it's about our allies. I think what we need to do is we need to make these about ourselves. And we're not parties to these disputes, we don't have claims in them, but we do have very direct economic and national security interests in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And I think we need to talk to the Chinese that way, and we need to act that way, rather than seeing this as sort of a nice-to-have, irritating problem, but not a fundamental challenge to U.S. interest.
Well, I think that's about as comprehensive as we can get. We have been speaking with Ely Ratner, always a very fascinating person when talking about Asia-Pacific issues. He's from the Center for New American Security. My name is Harry Kassianis at the National Interest. You have a great day.